It was a rainy afternoon when John, a young man in his early 20s, walked down the quiet streets of the small town. He had been searching for work for weeks, and hunger was gnawing at his stomach. His clothes were worn and slightly torn, and his shoes had holes in them. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, but he didn't want anyone to see just how tired and hungry he really was. The rain fell gently on his shoulders, soaking his coat, but he hardly noticed. All he could think about was finding a warm place to rest and, more importantly, a meal. As he wandered through the streets, John spotted a small diner tucked between two old brick buildings. The sign above the door was simple, painted in faded letters that read Maggie's Diner. The warm glow of the lights inside made it look inviting, like a safe little corner of the world amid the dreary afternoon. The smell of fresh coffee and baked bread drifted out the door and hit him instantly. His stomach growled, louder than he wanted it to. Without thinking twice, he opened the door and stepped inside. Inside, the diner was cozy, with wooden tables and red vinyl chairs that squeaked when people sat down. There were only a few customers, quietly eating and reading newspapers. Behind the counter stood Sarah, a young waitress with a kind smile. Her hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and her eyes seemed to sparkle with warmth. She noticed John immediately, probably because he looked lost and out of place. John hesitated at the entrance for a moment, unsure if he could even afford to eat. He had only a few coins left in his pocket, barely enough for a cup of coffee. But as soon as he saw Sarah approaching with a welcoming smile, he felt a little more comfortable. "Hello there," she said cheerfully, "would you like to sit down?" Her voice was soft and friendly, and it had a calming effect on him. John nodded and moved toward a corner booth. As he sat down, he tried to act confident, but it was obvious he was nervous. He looked around at the small diner, noticing the simple decorations, the old clock on the wall, and the pictures of local events pinned up near the counter. Everything felt familiar and comforting in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know why, but he felt that if he could just have a warm meal and a little kindness, the weight on his shoulders would lift, even if just for a moment. Sarah came back with a menu, but she could tell John didn't have much money. She crouched slightly to meet his eyes and said gently, "Don't worry about that. What would you like to eat?" John was taken aback. I can pay," he stammered, feeling embarrassed. But Sarah waved her hand. "It's okay. Everyone deserves a meal, especially on a rainy day like this." There was no judgment in her voice, only kindness. For the first time that day, John smiled. He told her he would just like some soup and a sandwich. Sarah nodded and went to prepare it herself. While he waited, John sat quietly, watching her move behind the counter with ease and warmth. She greeted other customers with the same friendly energy, never rushing, always making each person feel seen. John felt a strange sense of hope growing inside him. It was a feeling he hadn't had for months, maybe even years, that maybe not everything in life was so hard, that there were good people in the world who cared about others. When Sarah returned with the food, she placed the plate gently in front of John. The smell was comforting, the kind that reminded someone of home, of warmth, of safety. John's eyes watered slightly, not from sadness, but from the unexpected kindness. He thanked her, and Sarah just smiled, saying it was no problem at all. They started talking a little as he ate. Sarah asked about his day, where he was from, and if he was looking for work. John answered cautiously at first, but her warmth made him open up a little. For a brief moment, the world outside the diner didn't seem so heavy. The rain tapped against the windows, but inside, there was a sense of calm. John realized that Sarah wasn't just serving food, she was giving him hope, respect, and kindness at a time when he had almost forgotten those things existed. He felt an immediate connection with her, not romantic yet, but deep in a way that made him want to return the favor someday. As he finished his meal, he looked at Sarah and made a quiet promise in his heart, one that he wasn't even sure he could keep. He said softly, almost to himself, "One day, I'll come back, and I'll make sure you're never in need again." Sarah smiled, not fully understanding, but sensing the sincerity in his voice. That small interaction, filled with warmth, hope, and unspoken promises, would mark the beginning of a journey that would change both of their lives forever. John left the diner that afternoon, feeling lighter than he had in months. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were breaking apart, letting a few rays of sun peek through. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never forget the waitress who had fed him when he was hungry, nor the kindness that had made him believe that better days were possible. As John stepped out of the diner that rainy afternoon, a strange mix of hope and uncertainty filled him. The streets were now wet and glistening, reflecting the faint sunlight that had started to break through the clouds. He adjusted his soaked coat and paused for a moment, looking back at the little diner. Inside, Sarah continued her work, smiling and moving gracefully from table to table. The memory of her kindness lingered in his mind like a warm light in the middle of a dark storm. John had never been good with words, and he had never felt so grateful for someone he had only just met. But at that moment, a feeling surged within him, a determination to one day repay the kindness that had been shown to him. He knew his life was far from perfect. His pockets were nearly empty, his dreams felt distant, and the world seemed to move too fast for him to catch up. Yet, standing there in the soft glow of the diner lights, he felt a spark of courage. He turned around and walked back inside, catching Sarah by surprise. She looked at him curiously, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Is everything okay?" she asked. John hesitated, unsure how to begin, but then the words tumbled out, almost as if they had been waiting for this very moment to be spoken. I know I'm not much right now," he started, his voice slightly shaky, "but I promise you this: one day, when I'm successful, when I have enough to make life easier, I will come back and marry you." Sarah blinked in surprise. She wasn't expecting such a serious statement from a stranger, a man who barely had enough to pay for his meal. She felt a mix of amusement and curiosity. "Marry me," she repeated softly, tilting her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "That's a big promise for someone you just met." John nodded earnestly, his eyes locked on hers. "I know it sounds crazy, maybe even impossible. But I'm serious. I'll never forget what you did for me today. You showed me kindness when I had nothing, and I want to repay that. One day, I'll come back, and I'll keep my word." For a moment, the diner seemed to fall silent, as if the world itself was listening. Sarah studied him carefully. There was something in his eyes, a quiet strength, a raw honesty that made it hard to dismiss his words as just another passing statement. She could see that he wasn't boasting or joking, he genuinely meant every word. And yet, the promise sounded so fantastical, so far-fetched, that she couldn't help but laugh softly. "You really believe you can do that?" she asked, her tone teasing but warm. "You're just a young man with nothing. How do you expect to come back as? I don't know, a rich man ready to marry a waitress?" John smiled faintly, a mix of determination and nervousness. "I don't know exactly how it will happen. I don't have a plan yet, not a perfect one. But I know one thing: I won't give up. You made me believe that good things exist in the world, and that belief, it's going to drive me forward." Sarah shook her head slightly, still smiling. "Well, that's a bold promise. But I hope, somehow, you mean it," she said, her voice softening. "Life has a way of surprising us, but it's rare that someone sticks to a promise like that. You better keep it, John." He nodded again, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. The rain outside had stopped completely now, leaving the streets shimmering like silver, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. He left the diner once more, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. Every step he took felt lighter because he now carried a mission, one that wasn't just about money or success, but about keeping a promise to someone who had shown him the meaning of kindness. As he walked away, he didn't know what the future held. He didn't know how long it would take, or how many obstacles he would face. But the promise he had made that day, under the warm lights of the small diner, became the first true goal of his life. It wasn't just a statement, it was a vow that would shape his actions, his choices, and his determination. And somewhere, deep inside, he knew that the journey ahead would be as important as the destination itself. That single, simple promise, spoken quietly to a waitress who had fed him out of kindness, would come to define John's life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. It was the kind of promise that people might laugh at or dismiss, but for John, it was sacred. And as the young man disappeared down the wet streets, his heart was lighter than ever, carrying not just hunger or dreams, but hope and a vision of the day he would return to keep his word. After leaving the diner with a promise etched firmly in his heart, John knew that life wouldn't suddenly become easy. In fact, the road ahead seemed longer, steeper, and filled with challenges he had never imagined. He was just a young man with little money, no clear career path, and dreams that seemed almost impossible. Yet, the memory of Sarah's kindness and the vow he had made to her lit a small fire inside him, a fire that refused to go out no matter how cold and hard the world became. In the weeks that followed, John searched desperately for work. He took odd jobs wherever he could find them, washing dishes in local restaurants, delivering newspapers in the early morning fog, helping at construction sites under the scorching sun. Every day, he carried the weight of exhaustion in his bones, but he also carried a secret motivation, the promise he had made to the waitress who believed in him, even when he had nothing. That promise became a shield, protecting him from despair, and a sword, giving him the courage to keep moving forward. Life, however, had a way of testing him. Some days, he would work for hours and barely earn enough to buy a loaf of bread. Some nights, he would sleep on cold benches or in tiny, drafty apartments that smelled of damp and dust. Friends drifted away when he couldn't join them in their carefree lives, and family members shook their heads, warning him that his dreams were foolish. But John refused to let their doubts extinguish his determination. Each struggle reminded him of the promise he had made, and each obstacle strengthened his resolve to succeed, not just for himself, but for Sarah. Along the way, John learned more than just survival. He discovered patience, the quiet strength that comes from enduring hardship without giving up. He discovered creativity, finding new ways to make small amounts of money stretch just a little further. And he discovered resilience, the inner courage to face failure after failure, knowing that one day it would all be worth it. Every rejection from a job, every closed door, every disappointment became a step on the ladder he was climbing. John also started noticing small lessons in life. He realized that the people who treated him kindly, even in little ways, were the ones who mattered most. A neighbor sharing a cup of sugar, a bus driver offering a smile on a rainy morning, or a fellow worker offering advice, all of it reminded him that goodness existed in the world, just as Sarah's kindness had shown. Those tiny acts of generosity kept him grounded and gave him hope, even on days when hope felt like a distant memory. But there were moments of doubt, too. At night, lying on a thin mattress, John would sometimes think about how impossible his promise might be. "I'm just a nobody," he would whisper to himself. "How can I ever return as a rich man and keep my word?" The thought sometimes brought tears, but he never let them linger for long. Instead, he would imagine Sarah's warm smile, the glow of the diner lights, and the hope in her eyes. That vision became his fuel, reminding him that his hardships were temporary and that the promise he had made was worth every sacrifice. Years went by, and John's life slowly began to change. He started learning skills, reading books about business, and observing how successful people managed their lives. He invested his meager savings wisely, always thinking long-term, always thinking about the day he could fulfill his promise. Every small achievement, every bit of progress, no matter how minor, felt like a step closer to the reunion he dreamed of. Through hunger, exhaustion, rejection, and doubt, John's determination never wavered. He had learned the hardest lessons life could teach, and he had survived them with courage and patience. The promise he had made in that small diner was no longer just a memory, it had become his guiding principle, shaping every choice he made, every risk he took, and every challenge he faced. By the time John reached his late 20s, he was no longer the lost, hungry young man who had stumbled into Maggie's diner on a rainy afternoon. He had become someone who could face the world with confidence, someone who had endured life's harshest tests and emerged stronger and wiser. And though the journey was far from over, he carried with him one unwavering truth, the promise he had made to the kind waitress who fed him would one day be kept, no matter what it took. While John was struggling to survive and chasing his distant dreams, life continued in the small town for Sarah, the waitress who had unknowingly changed the course of his life. She had grown up in this town, a place where everyone knew everyone, and she had always been someone who believed in kindness. Working at Maggie's diner was not just a job for her, it was a place where she could touch lives in small, meaningful ways. Every day, she greeted her customers with a smile, remembered their favorite orders, and offered comfort when someone seemed down. Helping others came naturally to her, and it gave her life a quiet joy that few could understand. Sarah's days were busy but predictable. She would wake up early, long before the sun had risen, to open the diner. The smell of fresh coffee, sizzling bacon, and warm bread filled the air, welcoming the town's residents as they came in for breakfast. She loved the little routines of her work, the way the morning crowd ordered their eggs, how the children waved excitedly at her when they came in after school, and the small conversations that made the diner feel more like a family than a business. Yet, even in the middle of these familiar routines, Sarah sometimes found herself wondering about the people who had crossed her path and left a mark. It was one rainy afternoon, not unlike the day John had walked into her diner, when she remembered him. The young man with tired eyes, clothes that had seen better days, and a polite but hesitant smile. He had been hungry, desperate even, but what she remembered most was the way he had looked at her when she handed him the plate of food. There had been something sincere in his eyes, something that made her believe that despite his struggles, he would not give up on life. She smiled at the memory, a bittersweet feeling washing over her. She had no way of knowing what had happened to him, whether he had found work, survived, or even remembered her at all. As the years passed, Sarah's life was full but simple. She never married, focusing instead on the diner, her family, and the community she loved. She helped those who were struggling, offering free meals to people in need or lending a listening ear when someone needed to talk. Her life was not glamorous or wealthy, but it was rich in experiences, friendships, and a sense of purpose. She learned to appreciate the small joys, the laughter of children, the quiet satisfaction of a well-cooked meal, and the gratitude of someone she had helped without expecting anything in return. Yet, in quiet moments, Sarah sometimes thought about promises, about the strange twists of life, and about the young man who had made that bold declaration years ago. Would he ever come back, she wondered. She rarely spoke about it to anyone. To some, it might have seemed silly, even foolish, to hope for a reunion with someone she barely knew. But Sarah had always believed that kindness was never wasted. Even small acts could change lives, and perhaps, she thought, they could even come back in unexpected ways. Life wasn't always easy. The diner faced hard times when business slowed, bills piled up, and competition grew. She worked long hours, sometimes skipping meals herself, to keep the place running. But through it all, Sarah held on to her principles. She treated every customer, employee, and stranger with respect. She believed in fairness, honesty, and generosity, and these values had become the foundation of her life. They gave her peace even in difficult times, and they kept her hopeful for the future, no matter how uncertain it seemed. Despite her busy life, Sarah noticed that she had grown stronger over the years. She had learned patience, not the kind forced by circumstance, but the kind born of understanding that life unfolds in its own time. She had learned resilience, facing disappointments and setbacks without losing her spirit. And she had learned hope, the quiet, persistent belief that goodness and kindness could return, often in ways she never imagined. Though she continued to live her quiet, meaningful life, Sarah remained unaware of John's struggles and the path he was carving to fulfill the promise he had made. She didn't know that the young man who had walked into her diner years ago had made her a part of his life's mission, silently working through hardship, failure, and uncertainty to one day return. Yet, somewhere in her heart, Sarah sensed that the world was full of possibilities, and perhaps, that mysterious promise might one day become reality. And so, Sarah's life went on, filled with ordinary moments, extraordinary kindness, and a sense of quiet hope. She didn't know when, or even if, the young man would return, but she lived her life with the same generosity and warmth that had once changed his world forever. Little did she know, The story of their lives was slowly moving toward a moment that neither of them could have predicted, a reunion that would test fate, patience, and the strength of a promise made long ago. Years of struggle had shaped John in ways he could have never imagined. The boy who had walked into Maggie's diner, hungry, tired, and full of uncertainty, had transformed into a young man with vision, determination, and a quiet confidence that came from surviving life's harshest tests. But even as he grew stronger, wealth and success seemed like distant dreams, almost unreachable. The world had been relentless, throwing obstacles at him at every turn, jobs that didn't pay enough, rejections that stung sharply, and moments of doubt that threatened to crush his spirit. Yet John never let those hardships define him. He clung to one thing, the promise he had made to Sarah. That promise became a beacon, guiding every choice he made, every risk he took, and every small victory he celebrated. The turning point came unexpectedly, as these things often do. One afternoon, John stumbled upon a small opportunity while working a modest accounting job. A local business owner needed help managing his finances, and though it wasn't glamorous, John approached it with determination. He applied every lesson he had learned from his years of struggle, attention to detail, creativity, and unwavering patience. Slowly, his efforts began to pay off. The business improved under his guidance, and the owner recommended him to other clients. Word spread that John was someone who could be trusted, someone who could deliver results even under pressure. This small success ignited something powerful within him. John realized that wealth wasn't built overnight, it was constructed brick by brick, decision by decision, day by day. He began to study more, reading books about business, finance, and entrepreneurship late into the night. He networked, learned from mentors, and invested carefully, always mindful of the promise that had started this journey. He wasn't doing it just for himself, he was doing it for Sarah, for the young waitress who had once fed him and shown him that kindness mattered. That thought gave him a focus that nothing else could provide. Opportunities that had once seemed impossible started to appear. John found himself in positions where he could take calculated risks, launching a small business, investing in local ventures, and gradually expanding his reach. Each success, no matter how small, felt monumental. But he didn't allow pride or arrogance to take root. He remembered the days of hunger, the nights of uncertainty, and the countless moments when he had almost given up. Those memories kept him grounded, reminding him that the turning point was not the end of the struggle, it was the beginning of a new chapter. John's transformation was not just financial, it was personal. He had learned patience, resilience, and humility in ways that no school or training could have taught. He had discovered that real success wasn't measured solely in money but in the ability to stay true to one's word, to honor promises, and to use one's resources to make a positive difference in the lives of others. And the promise he had made to Sarah remained at the center of it all, a constant reminder of why he had started this journey in the first place. The months turned into years, and John's wealth grew steadily. He became known not just for his business acumen but also for his integrity and kindness. Even as he climbed higher, he remembered the small diner, the warm smile of a young waitress, and the moment that had ignited his determination. He planned meticulously, thinking about the perfect way to return to Maggie's diner, to fulfill the promise he had carried in his heart for so long. It wasn't just about the money or the success, it was about honor, gratitude, and the human connection that had inspired him from the very beginning. Finally, after years of relentless effort, John reached a point where he could step back and take a breath. He was financially secure, respected in his community, and ready to make good on the vow he had made years ago. But beyond the wealth and recognition, what mattered most was the journey itself, the lessons learned, the challenges overcome, and the inner strength forged in fire. He had grown into someone who could face the world confidently, but he had also grown into someone who never forgot kindness, compassion, or promises. And so, with careful planning and a heart full of hope, John prepared to return to the diner that had changed his life. He imagined Sarah's face, the surprise in her eyes, and the warmth of her smile as he walked back through those familiar doors. The turning point had not just been about success, it had been about becoming worthy of keeping the promise that had defined his life for so many years. This was the moment when his past struggles, sacrifices, and dreams would converge, and he would finally take the first step toward fulfilling a vow made in humility, gratitude, and hope. After years of struggle, learning, and hard work, John had finally reached the point where he could fulfill the promise he had made. But it wasn't just enough for him to simply walk back into the diner and announce that he was now wealthy. No, this moment had to be perfect, meaningful, and unforgettable. He wanted Sarah to understand that every step he had taken, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, had been motivated by the promise he had whispered to her years ago. He wanted her to see that his return wasn't just about money, it was about gratitude, respect, and the bond that had quietly existed between them since that rainy afternoon. Planning the return became a mission in itself. John thought carefully about every detail. How would he enter the diner? Would he go alone or with friends to support him? What words would he say when he saw Sarah? How could he make sure that she knew the years of struggle and dedication were all for her, without overwhelming her with the story of his journey? These questions swirled in his mind constantly, and each day he made a list, refining his plan until it felt just right. He visited the town in secret, observing Maggie's diner from a distance. The familiar glow of the sign, the smell of coffee drifting into the street, and the laughter of customers reminded him of the day he had first met Sarah. It felt surreal to be back, knowing he was no longer the hungry young man who had stumbled through the door years ago. Yet, beneath his confidence, he felt a flutter of nerves. What if she didn't remember him? What if she didn't believe he had truly kept his promise? The thought made his stomach tighten, but he reminded himself that sincerity always finds a way to be recognized. John also considered the timing. He wanted to return when the diner was busy enough to feel alive but not so crowded that Sarah would be overwhelmed. He thought about the moment carefully, what she would be doing, whether she would have a small break to talk to him, how the first words would be exchanged. He even rehearsed in front of the mirror, practicing the words he had waited years to say. I promised I'd come back, and I have kept that promise. Every time he rehearsed, he felt the weight of the promise lift slightly, replaced by a surge of anticipation and hope. While planning, John also reflected on the lessons he had learned along the way. He realized that the journey had been as important as the destination. The struggles, failures, and sacrifices had shaped him into someone who could finally return not just with wealth, but with humility and understanding. He knew that returning as a millionaire was meaningless if he didn't carry the same values he had cultivated during those years of hardship. Gratitude, kindness, and respect had to accompany the wealth. As the day approached, John's excitement grew, mixed with a quiet nervousness. He imagined Sarah's expression, the surprise, the recognition, the joy, and he felt a rush of emotion that he could barely contain. He also thought about the diner itself, about the people who had worked there over the years, and about the small town that had witnessed his transformation from a struggling young man to a successful adult. Everything felt connected, as if fate had been preparing this moment for years. John even considered small gestures to make the reunion special. Perhaps a bouquet of flowers, a handwritten letter, or a plate of her favorite dessert. But he decided against extravagant displays. He knew that the simplicity of sincerity would mean more. The promise had been simple, made in a moment of honesty and need, and it should be fulfilled with the same authenticity. Finally, on the day he chose, John dressed carefully, making sure he looked presentable but not showy. He wanted to appear confident, respectful, and genuine. He took one last deep breath, reminding himself of the journey that had brought him here, the countless nights of doubt, the long days of labor, the sacrifices that had tested him in every way. All of it had been leading to this moment, and now it was time to act. With steady steps, John walked toward Maggie's diner, feeling the thrill of anticipation mixed with the reverence of the moment. The promise he had made years ago was no longer just words, it was a commitment he had lived by, and now he would see it fulfilled. Every heartbeat reminded him of why he had endured so much, why he had never given up, and why this return mattered more than any success he had ever achieved. Today, the young man who had once walked in hungry and uncertain was about to face the woman who had changed his life forever, ready to show her the power of kindness, patience, and promises kept. The day John had waited for all these years had finally arrived. Maggie's diner looked the same, yet somehow different, as if time had quietly polished its familiar warmth. The smell of fresh coffee, sizzling bacon, and baked bread filled the air, instantly transporting him back to that rainy afternoon years ago. His heart beat faster with every step toward the door. This wasn't just another visit, it was the culmination of a promise that had guided his life through hardship, struggle, and relentless determination. John paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath. The memories of the day he had first met Sarah were vivid in his mind, the way her eyes sparkled with kindness, the way she had offered him a meal when he had nothing, the way she had unknowingly inspired him to believe in a better future. Today, he was no longer the boy with tattered clothes and an empty stomach. He was a man who had survived, grown, and succeeded, but the nerves in his stomach reminded him that some things, like genuine human connection, could never be rehearsed. As he stepped inside, he scanned the diner. Sarah was behind the counter, just as he remembered, moving gracefully between tables, her smile as warm and welcoming as ever. She looked older now, but the essence of who she was, the kindness, the empathy, the gentle spirit, remained unchanged. For a moment, John felt a pang of fear. What if she didn't recognize him? What if the years had erased the memory of their encounter, the promise he had made? But before doubt could settle, their eyes met. Recognition flashed across her face. Her smile faltered, replaced by surprise, disbelief, and then awe. "John," she asked softly, almost whispering the name. The years melted away in an instant. It wasn't just the familiarity of his face, it was the energy, the presence, the quiet confidence that told her this was the same young man who had once walked in, hungry and lost, yet full of sincerity. John stepped closer, feeling the weight of the years and the promise behind every word he had waited to speak. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Do you remember me? Years ago, you gave me a meal when I had nothing. You showed me kindness, and I made you a promise that day." He paused, searching her eyes for a trace of recognition, for the spark of understanding that had connected them long ago. Her eyes glistened, and she nodded slowly. I remember," she said, her voice trembling. "You promised." John smiled, a mixture of relief and joy flooding through him. "Yes. I promised that one day I would come back, and I would honor that promise. I've worked hard every day since then, and I've never forgotten what you did for me. Today, I'm here to keep that promise." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The diner felt suspended in time, filled only with the unspoken emotions of two people whose lives had been quietly intertwined by a single act of kindness. Then, slowly, Sarah stepped closer, a smile breaking through the tears in her eyes. "I never imagined," she whispered, "I never imagined you'd actually come back." John reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small, simple envelope. Inside was a note, heartfelt and honest, expressing the gratitude, struggles, and dreams that had carried him to this moment. "This is everything I couldn't say back then," he said softly. "I wanted you to know that your kindness changed my life. You inspired me to keep going when everything seemed impossible." Sarah opened the note, her hands shaking slightly as she read the words. Tears streamed down her face, but her smile never faded. She looked up at John, her eyes shining with a mixture of amazement, joy, and disbelief. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I only did what anyone would do. I never thought it would mean this." John took a deep breath, then knelt slightly, holding her hand gently. "You believed in me when I had nothing. That belief guided me through every challenge. Today, I'm not just back to fulfill a promise, I'm back to honor you, the person who showed me that even the smallest act of kindness can change a life." For the first time in years, the diner seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls themselves were witnessing a miracle. Other customers looked on quietly, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding in front of them. The reunion was more than just a meeting. It was the collision of past and present, struggle and triumph, kindness and gratitude. It was proof that promises, when kept with sincerity, could transcend time and circumstance. Sarah squeezed his hand, finally finding her voice. "I'm so happy for you," she said, her heart overflowing with emotion. "And I'm proud of you, John. You kept your word." John smiled, feeling a sense of completion, of fulfillment, that no success, no wealth, and no recognition could ever provide. The reunion was not about money or grandeur, it was about human connection, loyalty, and the power of kindness. In that moment, both of them knew that their lives had changed forever, not because of the wealth he had acquired, but because of the love, respect, and promise that had endured through years of uncertainty. After the initial shock of seeing John, Sarah felt a flood of emotions she could barely contain. Joy, disbelief, nostalgia, and warmth all collided at once. For years, she had carried the memory of that rainy afternoon like a small treasure in her heart, wondering if the young man who had made that promise would ever return. And now, here he was, not just back, but transformed into someone who had endured hardship, grown stronger, and honored his word with unwavering dedication. It was a moment that neither of them could have predicted, yet it felt destined. John, standing before her, wasn't just a man who had achieved financial success, he was a man who had learned the true value of patience, perseverance, and gratitude. As he looked into Sarah's eyes, he realized that this reunion was more than the fulfillment of a promise. It was the culmination of years of learning, growing, and understanding what truly mattered in life. The wealth he had gained meant little without the human connection that had sparked his journey in the first place. He knelt slightly, holding her hands gently, and spoke with sincerity that resonated in every word. "Sarah, I promised you that I would return when I was able, and I have kept that promise. But beyond that, I want you to know that it wasn't just about becoming successful. It was about honoring the kindness you showed me when I had nothing, about never forgetting the people who believed in me, and about becoming someone worthy of keeping a promise like this." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she listened, her heart swelling with emotions she could barely put into words. She remembered the young man who had walked into her diner, hungry, hesitant, and unsure of the world. He had been a stranger then, but his sincerity had left an indelible mark on her. Seeing him now, fully grown, strong, and accomplished, filled her with awe and a profound sense of pride. She realized that this reunion wasn't just about John's success, it was about the power of hope, integrity, and human kindness. They stood together, hand in hand, and for a moment, the diner seemed to fade away. The years of struggle, the waiting, the dreams, and the doubts all converged into this one perfect moment. John had kept his word, and Sarah had shown that a small act of compassion could ripple through time, changing lives in ways that neither of them could have imagined. The two of them sat down, sharing stories of the years that had passed. John spoke of his struggles, the failures he had faced, the sacrifices he had made, and the determination that had kept him going. Sarah listened intently, moved by his honesty and the depth of his perseverance. In turn, she shared the life she had lived, the joys, the challenges, the people she had helped, and the lessons she had learned. Through these stories, they realized how intertwined their lives had been, connected by a single act of kindness and a promise made in sincerity. As the hours passed, the diner became more than a place of food and work, it became a witness to something rare and extraordinary. They laughed, reminisced, and marveled at how life had brought them back together. John realized that no wealth or success could ever replace the sense of fulfillment that came from keeping a promise, from honoring someone who had made a lasting impact on his life. And Sarah understood that the smallest acts of kindness, even those given without expectation, could create miracles in ways she had never imagined. Eventually, John spoke again, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I want this to be more than a reunion. I want us to build something together, to honor the bond that began here years ago. Will you let me?" Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing not just the man he had become, but the journey he had undertaken, the struggles he had endured, and the sincerity that had never wavered. She smiled, a mixture of relief, joy, and hope, and nodded. "Yes, John. I believe in you, and I believe in what we can share." In that moment, the story came full circle. The young man who had entered a diner years ago, hungry and uncertain, had returned not just with wealth but with integrity, gratitude, and love. The waitress who had shown kindness without expectation had witnessed the fulfillment of a promise that had taken years to achieve. Their story was a testament to patience, perseverance, and the extraordinary power of human connection. It was proof that kindness never goes unnoticed, promises are meant to be kept, and the journey, no matter how difficult, can lead to moments of true fulfillment and joy.